Albert Walden's fist came down on the banker's mahogany desk with a force that rattled the inkwell and sent a spray of documents sliding to the Persian rug below. The sound cracked through the quiet office like a pistol shot, and every man in that room went still as stone. "Her name goes on that deed first," Albert said, his voice low and absolutely certain, the kind of certainty that had driven 10,000 cattle across 300 miles of scorched Texas earth. "Or this deal does not happen." Gerald Morse, the banker, sat behind his desk with the careful stillness of a man who had learned long ago that powerful men were most dangerous when they were quiet. He was not a small man, but sitting across from Albert Walden, he looked diminished, like a candle beside a bonfire. Morse's fingers tightened on the fountain pen he had been preparing to use for the signing, and his eyes moved briefly to the two other men in the room, both of them associates of the Cattle Growers Consortium, both of them holding papers worth considerably more than most men earned in a decade. "Mr. Walden," Morse said, his voice slicked with the kind of professional calm that men like him practiced in mirrors, "the consortium's arrangement is quite standard. The property deed would naturally be registered in your name as the primary landholder and—" "I know what is standard," Albert said, and he straightened to his full height, broad shoulders filling the room in a way that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with something that lived in a man's bones when he had spent 35 years earning every single thing he had. "I am telling you what is happening. Hazel Shepard's name goes on that deed before mine, or I walk out that door and I take every head of cattle, every acre of grazing rights, and every dollar of investment that comes with the Walden name, and I find myself another bank in another county." The silence in the office was enormous. Morse studied him for a long moment, and then something shifted in the banker's expression. Not respect, not yet, but the dawning recognition that Albert Walden was not a man making a theatrical gesture. He was a man stating a fact. "Very well," Morse said at last. "I will have the deed redrawn by morning." Albert nodded once, picked up his hat from the chair beside him, and walked out of that office into the blazing New Mexico afternoon. And the moment the door closed behind him, he allowed himself to breathe again, long and slow, because what had just happened in that room was not just a business decision. It was the conclusion of something that had begun 8 months ago, in the dust and heartbreak of a woman who had almost lost everything, and a man who had almost let her go. 8 months earlier, the town of Cobre Rojo, New Mexico Territory, 1882. The summer had come in hard that year, the way summers did in the high desert, with a ferocity that cracked the earth and bleached the color from the sky until the horizon was a white smear between the brown land and the white nothing above it. The Santa Fe Railroad had reached Cobre Rojo 2 years prior, and the town had swollen with that particular fever that railroad towns caught, the sense that everything was becoming, that fortunes were a matter of positioning and nerve. Albert Walden had been in Cobre Rojo for 6 days when he first saw Hazel Shepard, and he saw her under the worst possible circumstances. She was standing in front of the land office on Mesa Street, and she was not crying, which told Albert more about her than anything else could have. Her jaw was set, her green eyes were dry and bright with a fury that had been refined down to something almost crystalline, and in her hands she held a sheaf of papers that she had clearly just been handed from the land office window, because the clerk was still watching her through the glass with the anxious expression of a man who had delivered bad news and was braced for the consequences. Albert had come to town to look at a stretch of grazing land that a rancher named DuPont was selling, nothing more than that, a business errand in a town he had never planned to spend more than a week in. He was walking toward the assay office when he passed close enough to Hazel Shepard to hear what she said, barely above a whisper, to the papers in her hands. "You snake," she said softly. "You absolute snake." Under most circumstances, Albert Walden was a man who minded his business with the same dedication he brought to everything else. He had built his cattle operation from 20 head and a borrowed saddle, and he had done it by keeping his eyes on his own work and his hands off other people's problems. But there was something in the tone of that whisper, something stripped raw and furious and quietly devastated, that stopped him on the boardwalk as surely as if someone had grabbed his arm. He turned. She was already folding the papers with controlled, precise movements, tucking them into the leather satchel at her side. She was perhaps 27, he guessed, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a practical straw hat, and she wore the clothes of a working woman, a simple cotton dress the color of sage, boots that had seen genuine use, not the decorative kind that city women brought out west to feel adventurous. Albert hesitated, which was unusual for him. He stepped closer. "Pardon me, ma'am, I don't mean to intrude, I just wanted to make certain you were all right." She looked up at him with those green eyes, and the assessment she performed in that single glance was thorough and unsentimental. She measured him from hat to boot and arrived at some conclusion that seemed to produce neither warmth nor hostility, only a kind of careful neutrality. "I'm not all right," she said plainly, "but that is not your concern." "No," Albert agreed. "It isn't." There was a pause. "My father's ranch has just been legally transferred to the bank," she said, and he got the impression she was saying it aloud more for her own benefit than for his, the way people repeated terrible truths to make them real. 3 generations of Shepards built that land. And now Gerald Morse at the First Territorial Bank of Cobre Rojo has it, because my father borrowed against it when the drought killed half the herd 3 years ago, and the payments fell behind, and the grace period they promised him turned out to be exactly as binding as a handshake in a windstorm. Albert looked at the land office. He looked back at her. "When did this happen?" "The transfer was finalized this morning." She squared her shoulders. "My father died 4 months ago. I came back from Santa Fe to manage the affairs. I had the payments nearly caught up. I was 2 months and a portion from clearing it entirely." She stopped, pressed her lips together. Apparently 2 months and a portion was 2 months and a portion too long for Gerald Morse. There it was, the shape of the betrayal, clean and ugly in the afternoon light. Albert removed his hat. "Albert Walden," he said. "I raise cattle. I have an operation up near Las Vegas, New Mexico. I am in Cobre Rojo looking at a grazing property." She regarded his outstretched hand for a moment. Then she shook it once with the firm grip of a woman who had grown up working. "Hazel Shepard." He looked at the land office again and then at her, and the part of him that had been running cattle operations for 15 years, the part that understood leverage and timing and the geometry of situations, was already working. "Which property?" he asked. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. Which property did the bank take? I'm looking for grazing land. Is the Shepard property suitable for cattle?" Something moved behind her eyes. Caution. The particular wariness of a person who had very recently been betrayed and was therefore disinclined to trust the motives of a stranger who arrived with questions. "The Shepard property is 340 acres, she said slowly. "Good grass on the northern section, creek water year-round. The south pasture is rougher but has good browse. It was a working sheep operation for 30 years. "Sheep," Albert said. "My family kept sheep," she said with a slight lift of her chin, the defensive posture of someone accustomed to being looked down upon for it in cattle country. "They were not cattle people, but the land does not know the difference between what walked on it. The grass does not care." He nodded. He was thinking. He was thinking in a way he usually reserved for major decisions which were supposed to be made slowly and with complete information. He was thinking too quickly for comfort, and he noticed this and did it anyway. "Miss Shepard," he said, "I would like to hear more about that property, and I would like to buy you a cup of coffee while you tell me about it if you are willing." She looked at him for a long, searching moment. "Why?" she asked directly. He respected the directness so much it almost made him smile. "Because I came here looking for grazing land, and it sounds like the bank is about to have some. And because," he added, and this part surprised him as he said it, as though the words arrived from somewhere he had not deliberately consulted, "you look like someone who deserves to have at least one thing go right today." She was quiet for a beat. Then something in her expression softened, not much, not obviously, but he caught it. "The coffee at Milligan's is tolerable," she said. "Nothing else on this street is." They walked together to Milligan's, which was a dry goods store with a small counter and a coffee pot that was always on, and they sat on opposite sides of a narrow pine table, and Hazel Shepard told Albert Walden about the land her grandfather had claimed in 1851, the adobe house her father had built on the East Ridge, the creek that ran cold even in August, the way the northern pasture smelled after rain. She talked about the land the way people talk about something they love and are trying not to lose, which is to say, she talked about it with a precision that was almost clinical, because sentiment was dangerous when the thing you loved was already gone. Albert listened. He asked questions, practical ones, about water rights, acreage boundaries, the condition of the fencing. He drank his coffee and watched her and listened, and somewhere between the description of the creek and the story of the old windmill her father had repaired 17 times with 17 different ingenious solutions, he realized with a start of something unfamiliar that he was not listening for the land information anymore. He was listening because of her. Because the way she spoke, with that spare and unsentimental clarity that kept breaking open at the edges to reveal the grief underneath, was the most honest thing he had heard in years, possibly in his life. He pushed the thought aside. He was a man of business, and there was a business proposition forming in his mind that required clear thinking. "What would it take to get that land back from Morse?" he asked. She put her cup down. "More money than I have." "What if you had a partner?" The wariness returned to her eyes like a shutter closing. "What kind of partner?" "A business partner," he said carefully. "I need grazing land. You know that land better than anyone alive. I have capital. If Morse is willing to sell, we could make an arrangement, the kind where your family's land is back in the Shepard name, and I have the grazing rights I came here looking for." He paused. "It would be a genuine arrangement. Contracts, lawyers, fair terms." Hazel studied him across that pine table for a very long time. Outside, a wagon went past and the sound of iron wheels on packed dirt filled the silence between them. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You don't know me. There's no reason you should care what happens to this land or to me." Albert considered how to answer that honestly. He had made his reputation on honesty in business, and he was not about to abandon it now. "I don't know you," he agreed. "But I know a crooked situation when I see one, and I know good land when I hear about it. The business reason is real and sufficient." He hesitated. "The other reason," he said, "is that I watched you hold yourself together in front of that land office when anyone else would have broken, and I think that is the kind of character that deserves a fair chance." Hazel was quiet. "I think," she said finally, "that you should know I am not a woman who needs saving." "No," he said, "you're a woman who needs a fair deal. That's different." Something that was almost a smile crossed her face, quick and involuntary, like a bird passing a window. She folded her hands on the table. "Tell me what you are proposing specifically." And so he did. The following 3 weeks were among the most complicated and interesting of Albert Walden's professional life, and they were interesting for reasons that had far more to do with Hazel Shepard than with the mechanics of the land deal. The land deal itself was straightforward enough in concept, though Gerald Morse made it as difficult as he could in practice. Albert went to the bank the morning after his coffee with Hazel and made an offer on the Shepard property, and Morse, who was the particular breed of small-town banker who mistook cunning for intelligence, tried to play games with the price and the terms that Albert had no patience for. What Morse did not know, and what Albert revealed at the exact moment it would cause the most strategic impact, was that the Cattle Growers Consortium of New Mexico Territory had been looking for a major grazing acquisition in the Cobre Rojo area for 2 years, and that Albert Walden's endorsement of a property was worth considerably more than the property itself to their decision-making. If Morse wanted consortium business in his bank, which would represent the single largest financial relationship in the county's history, he would make the deal on Albert's terms. Morse made the deal. But what Albert had not told Hazel, not at first, was that his proposed terms included her name on the deed. He had simply said he would handle the negotiations, and she had agreed, because she had very little leverage and she knew it, and because something in the deliberate, unhurried way Albert Walden approached a problem made her feel, against her better judgment, that he was someone who did what he said he would do. He told her about the deed clause when he came back from the bank. She had been staying at the Cobre Rojo Hotel, a modest two-story building on the main street, and he found her in the small front parlor where guests could sit, working on what appeared to be a ledger. She looked up when he came in, and he saw the anxiety in her face that she was working hard to conceal. He sat down across from her, the same way he had sat in Milligan's, direct and unassuming. He told her the terms Morse had agreed to. When he got to the part about the deed, she went very still. "My name," she said slowly, "on the deed." "First," he confirmed. "Hazel Shepard, then Albert Walden. The property is secured to the Shepard family name first. I have the grazing rights, documented separately. If anything happens to our business arrangement, the land reverts to full Shepard ownership with a buyout requirement." She stared at him. "That is not the arrangement you proposed. You said a business partnership. You didn't say anything about putting the land in my name." "I said the land would be back in the Shepard name," he said. "It will be. You could have simply purchased it yourself. You had no obligation to include me in the title." "No," he agreed. "Then why?" He met her gaze steadily. "Because it's the right thing to do. Your family built that land. You nearly saved it yourself on your own with almost nothing. You were 2 months from clearing the debt. That tells me everything I need to know about what you are capable of. Putting your name on that deed is not charity. It is accuracy." Hazel looked down at her ledger. She looked back up at him. And for the first time since he had met her, the composure she wore like armor showed a crack, not of weakness but of something more vulnerable and more real, the kind of expression people wear when someone does something genuinely unexpected and kind, and they do not know how to receive it. "Thank you," she said quietly. It sounded like it cost her something. "Don't thank me yet," he said with the ghost of a smile. "You still have to agree to let me run cattle on your northern pasture for 7 years. That surprised a short, real laugh out of her, and the sound of it did something unexpected to Albert's chest, like a key turning in a lock he had not known was locked. They drew up the contracts over the following week, with a lawyer brought from Las Vegas whose fees Albert paid, and whom Hazel interrogated so thoroughly about every clause that the man left looking quietly impressed. Hazel had a precise, unsparing mind for legal language, the kind developed by someone who had once trusted a handshake and learned better. During that week, they spent a great deal of time together by necessity, reviewing documents, visiting the property to verify boundary descriptions, meeting with the county surveyor, riding the fence lines in the dry summer heat. Albert had hired a horse for the duration of his stay, a solid bay quarter horse from the livery stable on 2nd Street, and Hazel rode her own horse, a gray mare she had left with the livery before coming to town, a compact and decisive animal that moved with the same no-nonsense efficiency as its rider. The first time they rode the property together, Hazel was all business, pointing out landmarks and boundary markers with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent years learning every acre by heart. Albert rode beside her and listened and watched, and he noticed things he had no professional reason to notice. The way she sat her horse, confident and easy, without the self-consciousness that men sometimes brought to observing whether a woman could ride, because she genuinely did not care whether he was impressed. The way she paused at the top of the East Ridge and looked out over the land with an expression that was at once grief and love, and quickly shuddered both. The way she knew every plant by name. "That is desert willow," she said, pointing to a cluster of slender trees along the creek bank, their trailing branches hung with pink blossoms. "My mother planted 3 of them when she came as a bride. The others have seeded themselves over the years." She paused. "My mother is buried at the base of the largest one." Albert looked at the tree. He said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say, and Hazel had not said it to invite sympathy. She had said it because it was a fact about the land, the same way she might have mentioned a water source or a fence post. And yet it was also the most private thing she had told him, and they both knew it. "I will make sure those trees are protected in the grazing boundaries," he said. She looked at him. A brief, direct look that said she had heard more in that than the practical statement. "Thank you," she said. The same 2 words as before, but different this time. They were nearly back to town before she asked him the question she had clearly been holding. "You said you have an operation near Las Vegas. How large?" "Currently, 4,000 head," he said. "2 full-time hands, 3 seasonal. I own the main property outright and lease additional grazing from 2 neighboring ranches." She did a quick mental calculation he could see in the slight movement of her expression. "That is a very successful operation for one man. I've been at it 15 years. Do you have family there?" "A wife," he shook his head. "Never married." She absorbed this with the same neutral efficiency she brought to most information. "Why not?" It was a direct question, possibly too direct, and they both knew it, and she seemed to realize it a half-second after she asked it because a slight color came to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. "Forgive me, that was impertinent." "It was honest," he said. "I don't mind honest questions." He considered his answer. "I spent most of my 20s building something from nothing, and that doesn't leave a lot of room for much else. By the time I had built enough to feel like a man worth knowing, I had also built habits of solitude that are hard to break." He paused. "What about you?" "I was engaged once," she said matter-of-factly, as though reporting a weather event. "To a man in Santa Fe, 3 years ago. He was a lawyer. He was charming and well-read, and he had very good handwriting, which I found disproportionately appealing." A short pause. "He also had a secret wife in Albuquerque." Albert said nothing for a moment. "That is a significant secret to keep." "Yes," she agreed. "It taught me to ask better questions." He glanced at her sideways. She was looking straight ahead, her profile composed and clear against the white sky. He found himself thinking, not for the first time, that she was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with fashion or softness, the kind of beauty that came from living closely and honestly with difficult things. "You mentioned you went to Santa Fe," he said. "What were you doing there?" "I was a bookkeeper," she said, "for a dry goods merchant on Palace Avenue. I had left the ranch after my mother died, partly because my father found my presence difficult, which I understood, and partly because I needed to be useful somewhere I could feel useful. I sent money home when I could. When father died, I came back to find the debt situation and manage it." She turned her head to look at him. "I nearly had it managed." "I know," he said quietly. They rode for a while in silence, and it was the kind of silence that was not uncomfortable, but rather full of things being said below the level of words. The deed signing happened on the last Thursday of June, 1882, and if Gerald Morse was not happy about the final terms, he was professionally skilled enough to conceal it behind appropriate ceremony. Hazel sat across from him and signed her name first, in careful, unhurried script, and Albert watched her face as she did it, the deliberate press of pen to paper, and the quiet exhale afterward, and he thought that he had never seen anything as dignified as a person reclaiming something that was rightfully theirs. He signed second. The deed was notarized and recorded. Standing outside the bank in the afternoon heat, with the recorded deed in Hazel's satchel, she turned to him, and the armor was down, just for a moment, the practical efficiency set aside, and she looked at him with an openness that hit him somewhere in the center of his chest. "You did not have to do this the way you did it," she said. "You could have bought that land and I would have had nothing. Instead, you gave me back my family's home." "I gave you a business arrangement," he said, and his voice was slightly rougher than he intended. "Albert," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the formality of a question or a document attached to it, just his name in her mouth, and it was a different thing entirely. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. He put his hat on. He said, "I will be back in 3 weeks with the first cattle drive. I'll need to discuss the pasture rotation with you before then." She nodded. Professional. Back to the practical matter. He walked to his horse at the livery and stood for a moment with his hand on the saddle, and he thought clearly and with complete honesty that he was in significant danger of falling in love with Hazel Shepard, and that this was a complication he had not anticipated and did not know what to do with. He rode back to Las Vegas, New Mexico, to prepare the cattle drive. He thought about her the entire way. 3 weeks later, Albert Walden returned to Cobre Rojo as promised, ahead of a trail drive of 600 head of mixed cattle destined for the Shepard pastures. He had 2 seasoned hands with him, men named Cord and Denny who had worked for him for years, and who understood that the boss did not discuss personal matters on the trail, a rule that had never required stating because it had never previously been relevant. What he found when he arrived at the Shepard property was not what he expected. Hazel was there, which he had expected. What he had not expected was the state of the property, which was considerably more improved than it had been 3 weeks before. The fence line on the north pasture had been repaired, new posts set in with the precision of someone who knew what they were doing. The old windmill had been serviced, its blades turning cleanly. The adobe house on the east ridge had a new coat of whitewash on the south wall. Hazel was standing near the corral in work clothes, directing 2 local men who were setting a gate post, and she turned when she heard the cattle coming and shielded her eyes against the afternoon sun to watch them cross the low ridge. When Albert rode up to her, she nodded in greeting, practical and direct, as though they had not parted 3 weeks ago in front of the bank with something heavy and unnamed hanging between them. "The north pasture is ready," she said. "The fence on the east side needed extensive work, but it's done. The creek has enough flow for 600 head through the summer if you rotate them with the south pasture in the dry months." He looked at the fence. He looked at the windmill. He looked at her. "You've been busy." "I had 3 weeks," she said simply. "Did you do the fence work yourself?" "I hired local men for the post setting. I did the wire stretching." She turned back to watch the cattle with a professional eye. "They look sound," she said. "They're good animals," he said. "The north pasture will manage them well," she said. Then, without turning her head, "There is dinner at the house when you are ready. It is nothing elaborate." He paused. "You didn't have to do that." "Partners have dinner," she said, with perfect plainness, and walked back toward the house. He found when he went to the house that she had also made it livable again. It had been shuttered and empty for months, gathering the particular desolation of an abandoned home, but she had aired it out, swept it clean, restocked the kitchen. The table was set for 2, with a cast iron pot of beans and dried beef on the stove and cornbread wrapped in cloth to stay warm. They ate across from each other, and the conversation covered the rotation schedule, the water situation, the progress she had made on the accounts. And then, somewhere after the second cup of coffee, it drifted from business into something else. He told her about his early years, the ones he did not usually talk about, the years of failed attempts before the cattle operation found its footing, the winter he had worked in a silver mine near Tucson to survive, the borrowed $20 from a man whose name he never knew that had bought his first animals. She told him about her mother's stories of the land, passed down from her father who had claimed it in the years just after the Mexican-American War, when the territory was still figuring out what it was. She told him about learning to manage accounts from her father, who had mistrusted banks his entire life with the prescience of a prophet, and the dark humor in that given what had ultimately happened. At some point, the conversation stopped being about anything in particular and became simply 2 people talking in the lamplight, which is one of the oldest and most dangerous things in the world. Albert left well after dark, riding back to the camp he had made with Cord and Denny near the northern fence, and he lay under the stars with the cattle settling into their new ground around him, and he thought about Hazel Shepard's face in the lamplight and the way she laughed, which was not frequent but was entirely genuine when it happened. And he made a decision to be very careful and very patient, and to do absolutely nothing that might compromise the business arrangement they had made or the respect she had placed in him. He was also fairly certain he was going to fail at that completely. The weeks that followed built themselves into a rhythm that felt, to Albert, like something he had been missing without knowing it. He divided his time between the Cobre Rojo property and Las Vegas, managing both operations, but he found reasons to be in Cobre Rojo more than strictly necessary, reasons that were plausible and professional on their surface. Hazel was managing the property accounts and the operational logistics with an efficiency that consistently impressed him, which was not something he admitted often or lightly, because he did not impress easily. She had set up a system for tracking pasture condition that she had developed herself, based on the sheep management practices her father had used, adapted for cattle, and when he reviewed it, he saw immediately that it was better than his own. "This is better than what I do at the main operation," he told her, which was as close to lavish praise as his nature permitted. She looked at the papers in his hands and then back at his face, with an expression that was measuring whether he was being genuine or diplomatic. And when she determined it was genuine, the quiet satisfaction in her face was something he found he very much wanted to see again. "I have time to think carefully about things here," she said. "That is a luxury your larger operation may not permit." "I am going to steal your rotation tracking system," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I documented it carefully." He laughed. A real laugh, the kind he did not produce often, and that surprised both of them a little. There was a dance in Cobre Rojo in August, held in the town square on the occasion of the Territorial Founders' Day, which was a modest affair by the standards of larger towns, but was taken seriously in Cobre Rojo as the social event of the summer. Albert had not intended to attend. He was not a man who danced or attended social events with any enthusiasm, and he was staying out at the property. He went because Hazel mentioned it once in passing, saying that Mrs. Ortega down the road had asked her to attend, and that she supposed she would. He arrived at the town square at dusk wearing his best coat, which was not flashy but was well made from good dark wool, and he found Hazel among the gathering crowd near the musicians, talking to Mrs. Ortega and a cluster of townswomen. She was wearing a dress he had not seen before, a deep green that exactly matched her eyes, and she had done something different with her hair, pinned but softer, and she looked so entirely different from the woman in practical work clothes on horseback that for a moment he simply stood at the edge of the square and looked at her. She saw him and something moved in her expression, quick and then composed. She said something to Mrs. Ortega and crossed the square toward him. "You came," she said. "I did," he agreed. "I didn't think you would." "Neither did I," he said honestly. She smiled. "Come and meet Mrs. Ortega. She will want to interrogate you about your intentions for the Shepard land." He met Mrs. Ortega, who was a stout, sharp-eyed woman of 60 who had known 3 generations of Shepards, and whose interrogation was indeed comprehensive, covering Albert's background, his operational history, his financial standing, and his intentions with a directness that suggested she was not entirely convinced that a cattle rancher from Las Vegas was a suitable steward of land she had watched the Shepard family build. Albert answered every question directly and without defensiveness, which seemed to satisfy her. There was music, a fiddle and a guitar played by 2 men with the unhurried ease of people who had been playing together for years. There was dancing, the square dancing popular in territorial New Mexico, not the formal ballroom kind but the kind that involved a caller and a great deal of good-natured confusion. Albert did not dance. He stood with a glass of lemonade and watched, and Hazel came to stand beside him after 2 sets, slightly breathless from a vigorous do-si-do. "You should dance," she said. "I am not proficient," he said. "Nobody here is," she said. "That is the entire point." He looked at her. The lamplight from the strings of paper lanterns was warm and gold on her face, and there was a sparkle in her green eyes that was about more than the dancing. "Hazel," he said. His voice came out quieter than he intended. She looked at him, and whatever she heard in the way he said her name, it stopped the sparkle for a moment and replaced it with something more careful and more serious. "Albert," she said. There was a pause between them that was full of everything that had been accumulating for 2 months, every dinner at the house, every conversation that started as business and became something else, every moment on horseback when their knees came close on a narrow trail, every time she laughed and he filed the sound away somewhere he was not ready to examine. "May I take you for a walk?" he asked. "Away from the music for a moment." She studied him. She nodded. They walked to the edge of the square and then a little beyond, to where the paper lanterns gave way to starlight and the sound of the fiddle was softened by distance. The night smelled of dust and juniper and the particular coolness that the high desert produced after dark even in August. "I need to say something," Albert said, "and I need to say it plainly because I think plainness is what you respect, and it is what I can honestly offer." She turned to face him. "All right," she said. Her voice was quiet. "I have come to care about you," he said, "more than is strictly appropriate for a business arrangement, more than I intended when I came to Cobre Rojo. I'm not saying this to create complications or to change our arrangement in any way you don't want changed. I am saying it because I think you deserve to know, and because I think you would rather know the truth than have me pretend it isn't there." Hazel was quiet for a long moment. The stars above them were enormous, the way they are in the desert where there is no competing light. "I had decided," she said finally, "that I was finished with trusting men who presented themselves as one thing and were another." "That is a reasonable decision," he said, "after what you described." "Yes," she paused. "And then you came along and put my name on a deed instead of your own, and I have been trying to reconcile that with what I decided to think about men." Another pause. "It has been difficult." He waited. "I am not a woman who does things lightly," she said. "I do not make promises I don't mean, and I do not allow feelings that I am not prepared to follow through with." "I know that," he said. "I am not asking you for anything you are not ready to give. I am only telling you what is true." She looked at him for a long time. The fiddle played something slow in the distance. "I have feelings that are difficult to ignore," she said at last, and each word was chosen with the same care she brought to contract language precise and real. "That I have been choosing to ignore because I thought they were not prudent. I do not know that I can keep ignoring them." He reached out and took her hand slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and she did not step back. Her hand in his was warm and calloused from the fence work, and it closed around his with the same directness that characterized everything she did. They stood like that under the stars for a while, the sounds of the dance drifting to them from the square, and nothing else needed saying just then. What followed that evening was not a swift transformation, but something more like a gradual brightening, the way the eastern sky changes before sunrise, slowly and then all at once. Hazel did not abandon her caution, which Albert not only respected but actively appreciated, because he had no use for anything that was not genuine. She remained direct and clear-eyed and unsentimental in the practical matters of the partnership. She also began to allow him into the less practical parts of herself, the parts that had been carefully kept. She told him, one evening in early September while they sat on the East Ridge watching the sun go down over the desert, about the years after her mother's death, when she had been 22 and her father had retreated into a silence so complete it was like living with a ghost. She had tried to reach him through work, through conversation, through cooking his favorite foods, and nothing had worked, and eventually she had understood that her father's grief was something he had to live inside of, and that her staying was causing him pain rather than comfort, because she looked too much like her mother. "So I left," she said. "And I felt guilty for leaving, even though leaving was the right thing. I have felt guilty about it ever since, until I came back and there was nothing left to come back to except land and debt, and then I felt something worse than guilty." Albert was quiet. "What did you feel?" "Like I had failed him," she said, "even though he was dead, even though he had made choices I had no power over." She looked at the horizon. "Grief is not logical." "No," he said, "it isn't." He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 19, the year he had left Missouri with almost nothing and headed west. He had never gone back. He had sent money when he had it to his brother, who reported that their father was all right, and then when he was not all right, and then when he was gone too. The whole history of his family reduced to occasional letters that arrived months late and smelled of Missouri rain. "Do you regret leaving?" she asked. He considered it honestly. "I regret the missing," he said. "I don't regret what I built by going." She nodded slowly. "I understand that kind of reckoning." What neither of them said directly, but what both of them felt with the certainty of two people who were paying very close attention, was that somewhere in those conversations they had crossed over from something careful and professional into something much older and much less manageable. The kind of feeling that sits in your ribs when the person you are with says exactly the thing you did not know you needed to hear, not because they are trying to say the right thing, but because they are telling the truth, and the truth fits. Albert kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday in the middle of September, standing in the kitchen of the house on the East Ridge while they were washing up after dinner, which was the least dramatic possible setting. And yet it was exactly right because there was nothing performed about it. They had been standing side by side at the basin, talking about the autumn pasture rotation, and the conversation had simply stopped, and he had turned to look at her, and she was already looking at him, and then it was just the most natural thing in the world. She kissed him back without hesitation, and then she pulled back and looked at him with those clear green eyes and said, "I am not doing this casually." "Neither am I," he said. She studied his face. She nodded once as if confirming a calculation. "All right then," she said. They went back to washing the dishes, and the whole ordinary world continued around them, and everything was different. September moved into October, which in the high desert was the most beautiful time, when the cottonwoods along the creek went gold and the sky turned to a deep sharp blue, and the nights came cold and brilliant with stars. The cattle were doing well on the Shepard pastures. Albert's hands, Cord, and Denny had established themselves in a camp near the north pasture, and were managing the herd rotation according to Hazel's system, which they had initially regarded with the mild skepticism that two men who had been doing things a particular way for 15 years brought to innovation, and had thereafter adopted with the complete loyalty of converts. Albert was dividing his time formally now between Cobre Rojo and Las Vegas, with the balance tipping increasingly toward Cobre Rojo for reasons he was not hiding from himself or anyone else. He had a room at the Cobre Rojo Hotel, which was appropriate and practical, and he spent his evenings at the house on the East Ridge with Hazel. Mrs. Ortega, who was the undisputed social authority of the surrounding area, had made her assessment of Albert Walden and declared him, if not exactly what she had hoped for Hazel, at least acceptable, which was high praise from Mrs. Ortega, and which Hazel relayed to Albert with obvious amusement. "She says you answered her questions without flinching," Hazel told him. "She views that as indicating good character." "I have answered harder questions," he said. "She also says," Hazel added, with the particular light in her eyes that meant she was about to say something she found genuinely funny, "that you look at me the way her late husband looked at her, and that this is the most reliable indicator of a man's worth that she has ever observed." Albert was quiet for a moment. How did her late husband look at her? "She said like she was the only thing that was not a problem," Hazel replied. He looked at her. "Yes," he said simply. The color in her face shifted, and she looked down at the papers in front of her, but not before he saw the expression she was working to contain. The business with the consortium came in November, and it came, as most significant things did in Albert's experience, more quickly and with more complication than anticipated. The Cattle Growers Consortium of New Mexico Territory had been interested in making a major acquisition in the Cobre Rojo area for 2 years, as Albert had told Morse during their negotiation. What he had not entirely specified, even to himself, was the degree to which his own recommendation would influence their decision, or the scale of what they were actually proposing. They sent a representative, a man named Beaumont Price, who arrived from Santa Fe in November wearing a suit that was too good for the high desert and carrying a proposition that was, on its surface, exactly what Albert had been working toward for 15 years. A full consortium partnership, shared resources, access to markets in Denver and Kansas City that his individual operation could not reach, capital backing that would triple the size of his herd within 3 years. The Shepard property was central to the deal. The consortium wanted it as the anchor of their Cobre Rojo operation. Price arrived at the property on a November afternoon when the air was clean and cold, and the last of the cottonwood gold was clinging to the creek trees, and he sat in Hazel's kitchen with his good suit and his Santa Fe manners, and laid out the consortium's proposal with the practiced ease of a man who was accustomed to closing deals. The numbers were very large. The opportunity was, by any professional measure, extraordinary. And then Price said, smoothly and as an apparent afterthought, "Of course, for the consortium's insurance purposes, the property would need to be held in a single corporate name rather than the current shared arrangement." Hazel said nothing. She sat with her hands folded on the table and her face completely composed, and Albert watched her absorb the implication, which was not an afterthought at all, and both of them knew it. The implication was that her name would come off the deed. Albert looked at Price. "That is not how this property is held," he said, "and the arrangement of the deed is not negotiable." Price smiled pleasantly. "Of course the Walden interests would be fully preserved. We are simply suggesting that a consolidated ownership structure would streamline. What Mr. Price is suggesting," Hazel said quietly, "is that my name comes off the deed." Price's smile remained in place. "Consortium has standard protocols for no," Albert said. Price blinked. "I beg your pardon. I said no." Albert's voice was very even. "The deed is held as it is and will continue to be held as it is. If that is a condition of the consortium's proposal, then the proposal requires revision." Price looked at him with the bewilderment of a man who had not expected friction at this stage. "Mr. Walden, the financial terms here are—" "I understand the financial terms," Albert said. "I am telling you they are not sufficient to revise the deed arrangement. If the consortium wants the Cobre Rojo grazing rights, they will deal with the property as it stands. Both names on the deed, both parties in any agreement." Price studied him. Then he looked at Hazel, who was watching Albert with an expression that was very still and very searching. "I will have to communicate this to the consortium," Price said carefully. "Please do," Albert said. "Tell them also that the Walden endorsement, which is what brought them to this property in the first place, is contingent on the terms being what I have stated." Price left, and in the silence after his horse had gone from the yard, Hazel sat at the table and did not speak for a moment. The kitchen was warm with the smell of the coffee that had gone cold in their cups during the meeting. "You may have cost yourself the consortium partnership," she said finally. "Possibly," Albert said. "That partnership was everything you said you had been working toward." "Yes," he agreed. "Then why?" He looked at her. The afternoon light through the window lay across the table between them. "Because I told you," he said, "that both our names would be on that deed, and I don't break what I tell people." He paused. "And because your name belongs on that deed, Hazel, full stop, not as a courtesy, not as a strategic gesture. It belongs there because it is yours." She looked at him for a very long time, and then she did something he had never seen her do. She pressed her hand over her eyes for a moment, and when she took it away the composure was back, but it had cost her something to reconstruct it, and the fact of that cost was visible. "Albert," she said, her voice was slightly different, lower, "I need you to understand something." "All right," he said. "I have spent a very significant portion of my life," she said carefully, "learning not to need anyone. Not because I am proud, but because needing people and then being left, or having what they gave you taken back, is a kind of damage that accumulates." She paused. "And then you keep doing things that are so completely contrary to every lesson I have taught myself about what men do that I do not know what to do with you." He said nothing. He waited. "I love you," she said. The words came out with the same precision she brought to everything, careful and exact and absolutely genuine. That is a fact I have been sitting with for several weeks, and I think I am ready to say it plainly. Albert's chest did something complex and complete. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "I love you," he said. "I have been building to saying that for a long time." She turned her hand under his so their fingers interlaced. She looked at their hands together and then up at his face, and the expression she wore was something he had never seen on her before, the expression of a person who has decided to fully trust something, knowing the cost of trusting and paying it anyway. "What happens now?" she asked. "Well," he said, "first we find out whether Beaumont Price goes back to the consortium with what I said or tries to revise it." She almost smiled. After that, he said, "I would like to ask you, in the proper way and at the proper time, whether you would consider marrying me. But I am not asking that today because today has been a complicated enough day, and I want to do it properly." She looked at him steadily. "When is the proper time?" "When I know the consortium situation is resolved," he said, "and I can ask you without it being tangled up with business." "Albert," she said, "nothing in our lives has ever been untangled from business." He looked at her. She was right. "Fair point," he said. "Ask me," she said. He turned in his chair to face her directly. He held both her hands. He was not a man who had rehearsed things of this nature because he had never previously arrived at this nature, and so what came out was unrehearsed and therefore true. "Hazel Shepard," he said, "you are the most honest and capable and quietly extraordinary person I have ever known. I would be honored for the rest of my life to be in your company. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment, this man who had come to her on the worst day of her year with coffee and a fair deal, and had never once pretended to be less or more than what he was. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." They were married in the second week of December, 1882, in Cobre Rojo, in the small white church on Cottonwood Street that had been built with community funds 7 years before. The ceremony was conducted by Pastor Eli Graves, a spare and serious man who had the gift of brevity in his officiating, which both Albert and Hazel appreciated. Mrs. Ortega attended and was observed to cry once, which she denied afterward. Cord and Denny came in from the north pasture wearing their best shirts and their expressions of men doing their best to look appropriate to the occasion, which Hazel said afterward was more touching than a full wedding party would have been. The consortium situation resolved itself 1 week after the wedding, when Beaumont Price returned to Cobre Rojo with a revised proposal that included both names on the deed, a more favorable revenue split than the original offer, and an additional clause that Albert had not requested, but which Price presented as if it were a personal gift, naming the Cobre Rojo property as the primary operational hub of the consortium's New Mexico grazing network. Albert had expected them to walk. They had not walked. This told him something important about how much the consortium had needed him, which he filed away for future reference. He signed the consortium agreement with Hazel beside him at the bank, and this time Gerald Morse was so carefully neutral in his professionalism that it was its own kind of statement. The moment he and Hazel walked out of that bank with the signed documents was, Albert thought, one of the best moments of his life. Not because of the money or the partnership, but because of what it represented, an arrangement made on honest terms, no hidden motives, no fine print designed to strip someone of what they had built. "Do you want to tell me what you are thinking?" Hazel asked, as they stood on the steps of the bank in the December cold. "I am thinking," he said, "that your grandfather would be pleased." She was quiet for a moment, then she tucked her arm through his. "Yes," she said, "I think he would." The winter of 1882 and 1883 was the first winter Albert Walden had spent somewhere that felt like a home in a very long time. The house on the East Ridge was small and solid, the adobe walls holding the warmth of the fireplace efficiently, and on the coldest nights, the sound of the wind outside was simply the weather, not a threat. because there was a roof and walls and the woman he loved reading on the other side of the room. He had never realized before that the presence of a specific person could make the same space feel categorically different. Hazel, who had spent years alone managing things with solitary efficiency, adapted to cohabitation with the same matter-of-fact competence she brought to everything, though she admitted to him one evening, with the particular candor that arrived in her late at night by the fire, that she had cried the first morning she woke up and heard someone else in the kitchen. "Good tears," she specified quickly, "not sad ones." "I know," he said. "I could hear the difference." She looked at him. "You cannot actually hear the difference between kinds of tears from another room." "I know you," he said. She considered this. "Yes," she said, "you do." They worked the operation together through the winter, managing the herd through the cold months with the rotation system Hazel had developed, supplementing grazing with hay that Albert arranged to have freighted in from Las Vegas when the pastures went thin. The consortium provided additional capital and market access as promised, and by February of 1883, the operation was showing returns that far exceeded what either property had generated independently. Albert transferred the main management of his Las Vegas operation to a foreman he trusted, a quiet and reliable man named Hoskins who had been with him for 8 years and who he had been underpaying for the last 3, a fact he corrected when he gave Hoskins the position. He did not close the Las Vegas operation but made it a secondary concern because Cobre Rojo was where he lived now. Hazel was carrying their first child by spring. She told him on a March evening, sitting at the kitchen table with her ledgers spread in front of her. In the same direct way, she told him most things of significance, stating it plainly and watching his face to see what was there. What was there was a kind of joy that he was not sure his face was equipped to contain properly, because it came out all at once and ungoverned, and he crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and pulled her to her feet and held her carefully, because this information seemed to require care, and she laughed against his shoulder at the carefulness. "I am not made of glass," she said. "I have been stretching fence wire." "I know," he said. "We are going to have a discussion about the fence wire." "We will have that discussion," she said firmly, "and you will not win it." He held her a moment longer. "A child," he said softly, and the word had a different weight than it ever had. "A child," she confirmed, "in October if my calculation is right." "Is your calculation always right?" "Usually," she said. "Occasionally I round." The pregnancy did not slow Hazel down in any way she was willing to concede as significant, which was a source of mild ongoing tension between her and Albert for approximately the first 4 months, and then a source of genuine negotiation for the next 3, until they arrived at an arrangement they both found acceptable, which was that she would reduce the physical labor of the operation while retaining full management authority, which she had never been inclined to surrender in the first place. The summer of 1883 was gentler than the previous year. The rains came at the right intervals, the creek ran high and clear, and the north pasture produced the best grass Hazel said she had seen since her childhood. She said this while sitting on the east ridge one evening in July, with the desert stretched out gold and purple below them and her hands folded over her rounded middle, and Albert sat beside her and thought that he had not known, before he came to Cobre Rojo, that a person could be this content. He told her this. She turned her head to look at him with those green eyes, which were no different from the eyes he had first seen in the street outside the land office over a year ago, except that they looked at him now with the familiarity of a person who has seen all the parts of someone and made their peace with them. "Content," she said, testing the word. "Is that enough for you?" "Content is not a small thing," he said. "Content is what most people spend their whole lives reaching for, and most of them miss it." "Content is exactly right." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I am more than content. I am not sure I have a word adequate to what I am, but content is the direction of it." He took her hand. Below them the creek caught the last of the sunlight and turned it to silver. The cattle moved slowly in the north pasture, their shapes dark against the grass. Their son was born on the 14th of October, 1883, in the house on the East Ridge, attended by the town's doctor, a capable and steady woman named Dr. Clara Mendes, who had come to Cobre Rojo 2 years prior from Albuquerque, and who had earned the community's trust through the simple method of being very good at her work. The labor was difficult and long, and Albert waded through it with the particular anguish of a man who is not the kind to be useless in a crisis, and who is being required, by the nature of the situation, to be useless in a crisis. He sat outside the bedroom door and found uses for his hands, mending a piece of tack, sorting through mail that did not require sorting, drinking considerably more coffee than was medically advisable. When Dr. Mendes opened the door and said, "Mother and son are both well," Albert stood up and put his hand on the doorframe and breathed for a moment. He was allowed in, and he crossed to the bed where Hazel lay, exhausted and entirely herself, with a small bundled weight in her arms. She looked up at him, and her face was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, and he could not have said whether that was because of what she had just done, or because of what she was, or because of the way she looked at him. "Come and see," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her and looked at the baby, who was small and red and extraordinarily opinionated about his current conditions, expressing this opinion at volume. "He is perfect," Albert said, and the roughness in his voice was not something he attempted to manage. "He is quite loud," Hazel said. "I suspect that comes from your side." "I am not particularly loud," he said. "In business negotiations," she said, "you are capable of significant volume." He laughed softly, careful not to disturb the baby, who had found his opinion temporarily satisfied. "What shall we call him?" She had a name ready. She had told him she was holding it until she knew. "James," she said. "After my grandfather." "James Walden," he said. "James Shepard Walden," she said, with a look that made clear this was a statement of fact and not a question. He nodded immediately. "James Shepard Walden," he agreed. "Obviously." She leaned her head against his arm, careful with the baby between them, and he sat very still because the moment felt like something that would not return, and it deserved to be fully experienced. James Shepard Walden proved, in the following months, to be a child of strong opinions and remarkable lungs, which Hazel maintained came from Albert's side, and which Albert maintained was entirely environmental. He grew in the way babies do, requiring everything and producing joy out of proportion to the effort, and the house on the East Ridge, which had been a place of grief, and then a place of business, and then a home, became something more specific and complete. The operation continued to thrive through 1884 and into 1885. The consortium partnership had delivered as promised, and the Cobre Rojo property was producing returns that Albert had not fully projected, even in the optimistic version of his planning. Hazel's management system had been adopted across all 3 of the consortium's New Mexico properties, which she learned about from Beaumont Price during one of his quarterly visits, and which she received with the equanimity of someone who had always known it was a good system and was not surprised by this confirmation. Price had developed a healthy respect for Hazel over the months of their working relationship, which had been earned through a sequence of negotiations in which she had demonstrated that she understood financial documents at the level of the drafting rather than simply the reading, a capacity he had not initially anticipated, and which had rearranged his assumptions about the power structure of the Walden operation. "Your wife is remarkable," he told Albert at the end of one particularly comprehensive quarterly review. "I am aware," Albert said. "The rotation system alone has saved the consortium more than I care to calculate," Price said. "You should calculate it," Albert said, "and pay her accordingly." The look on Price's face indicated that he had not expected this, and Albert's expression indicated that this was not a casual suggestion. The compensation was renegotiated. Hazel handled the negotiation herself. In the spring of 1885, when James was a year and a half old and beginning to demonstrate an alarming interest in following the cattle at the fence line. Albert came home one evening from the north pasture to find Hazel sitting at the kitchen table with an expression he had learned to read over the past 2.5 years. The expression she wore when she was processing something significant and had not yet decided how to present it. He washed up and sat down and waited. "I received a letter today," she said. "From who?" "Gerald Morse," she said. Albert's expression shifted. He said nothing. "The First Territorial Bank of Cobre Rojo is in significant financial difficulty," Hazel said, with the perfectly level tone she used for facts she had complex feelings about. Apparently, Morse made a series of investments in a silver mining venture that did not produce as expected. He is looking to sell several of his land holdings. She placed the letter on the table between them. Albert read it. Morse was offering, at a price considerably below market value, a piece of land adjacent to the Shepard property's south boundary, a parcel of 60 acres that had been in his personal holdings for years and which, more significantly, controlled the secondary water access to the entire southern section of the valley. "If he sells that to someone else," Hazel said, "it creates a water rights situation that could become complicated." "Yes," Albert said. "He is selling it cheap because he needs the money quickly," she said, "and he came to us first." Albert was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel about buying land from Gerald Morse?" Hazel considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I feel," she said slowly, "that Gerald Morse made choices that produced consequences and that the consequences are not my responsibility to prevent. I also feel that that 60 acres and the water access is too important to this property to leave to chance." She folded her hands. "And I feel," she added, "that if we purchase it, I would like my name on that deed too." Albert smiled. Slowly, fully, the kind of smile that was rarely seen by anyone who did not know him well. "First," he said. "First," she agreed, and the word between them was more than about deeds. They bought the 60 acres. They bought it at the price Morse asked, because while Albert Walden drove a hard bargain in negotiations, he did not take advantage of desperate men, which was a distinction he held firmly. The deed was drawn up with Hazel Shepard Walden first, Albert Walden second, and the signing was performed in the same bank office where, 3 years prior, she had stood with foreclosure papers in her hands. Gerald Morse was professionally correct throughout the transaction. He did not make eye contact with Hazel for long. When they left the bank, Hazel paused on the steps and looked at the building for a moment, then at the land office down the street, then at the street itself, the dust and the horses and the wagons and the sky above it all. "3 years ago," she said. "Yes," Albert said. "I was standing right about there," she said, indicating the sidewalk in front of the land office, "with those papers." "I know," he said. "I was over there." She looked at him. "Why did you stop?" "I've told you," he said. "I heard you say something." "I said you snake," she said. "That made you stop." "The way you said it," he said. "Like you were absolutely furious and absolutely heartbroken and absolutely refusing to collapse." "I stopped because I have never seen someone hold themselves together that precisely in a moment that bad." She was quiet. Below them on the street, a wagon passed with a load of lumber, heading toward one of the new buildings going up on the east end of town. Cobre Rojo was growing. The railroad was making everything bigger. "I am glad you stopped," she said. "So am I," he said. She took his arm, and they walked down the steps together. And the afternoon was warm with the particular warmth of early spring in the high desert, when everything is just coming back. Time moved the way time does when it is full of things worth living, which is to say it moved both quickly and in detail, each day distinct and accumulating into something larger than any single day. James learned to walk and then to run and then to talk, which he did with the relentless energy of a child who had a great deal to say about everything. He wanted to know the name of every cow individually, and Hazel, who had grown up naming sheep, obliged him with a creativity that Albert found genuinely amusing. "That one is Biscuit," James announced gravely to Albert one morning in the fall of 1885, indicating a mid-sized red cow with the air of someone conveying important information. "Is she?" Albert said. "Mama said because of her color." Albert looked at the cow, then at Hazel, who was watching from the fence with a composed expression. "Biscuit," he said. "I maintain," Hazel said, "that the naming system increases his engagement with the operation." "The hands are going to have opinions about this," Albert said. "The hands," Hazel said, "have already been informed that James's names are the operational names for this herd, and they have adjusted." He looked at her. "Cord and Denny agreed to call the cows by names. Cord said it was the strangest thing he'd done in 15 years of ranching," Hazel reported. "Denny said it was the best thing. They are still in negotiation." Albert put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned against him slightly, comfortable in the way of two people who have been beside each other long enough that it is simply the natural shape of standing. The second pregnancy came in the winter of 1885, and this time Hazel told him while they were riding the south fence line on a cold February morning, which was how he knew she had been sitting with it for a few days, because she had waited until they were doing something practical before saying it, which was her way of managing news that required her to be steady. "The baby will come in August," she said. He pulled his horse up. She did the same, and they sat facing each other on the south pasture with their breath showing in the cold air. He reached across and took her hand. "Are you well?" he asked. "Entirely," she said. "The sickness was worse this time in the mornings, but it has settled." "Why didn't you tell me about the sickness?" "Because you would have worried in a way that would not help either of us," she said simply. He looked at her for a moment. "Hazel, you can tell me when you are unwell." "I know I can," she said. "I am telling you now." This was, he had learned, the distinction she made. Not that she didn't trust him, but that she had been self-sufficient for so long that the sharing of difficulty still required a conscious choice. She was better at it than she had been, and she knew he was learning to wait for it rather than demand it. They had both learned things these years together, the specific shapings of two people who chose each other every day in small ways that added up to something large. "August," he said. He calculated. "James will be 2.5. He will be interested," Hazel said. "He has already asked me why the cow named Magnolia has a baby and he does not." Albert laughed. The sound rose white into the cold air. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to be patient," she said. He was not satisfied with this answer. "He gets that from you," Albert said. "He gets most things from both of us," she said, with the slight smile that appeared when she said something that pleased her. The second child was a girl, born in August of 1886, smaller and more fierce than her brother had been, and from the very first hour of her life completely certain of her own opinions. They named her Clara, for Dr. Mendes, who had brought her safely into the world, and she was called Clara Walden, but she was, from the very beginning, her own person. James regarded his sister with the complicated magnanimity of an older sibling who had requested a baby and was now uncertain about what he had requested. "She is small," he reported to Albert. "She will grow," Albert said. "Does she have to?" "She does," Albert said. James considered this philosophically. "All right," he said, "but she cannot name the cows. That is mine." "We will discuss it when she is older," Albert said. "You will lose that negotiation," Hazel said from the bed, where she was watching this exchange with the expression of someone who was deeply tired and deeply happy in the same moment. Albert crossed to the bed and sat beside her. She was holding Clara, who had stopped her initial fierce protesting and had arrived at a temporary accommodation with the situation. James climbed up to sit on Albert's other side and leaned against his arm. The room was warm, and the evening light was coming through the window in long bars, catching the dust in the air and making it golden. Albert looked at his wife and his daughter and his son leaning against him, and the full weight of what his life had become settled over him like something warm. "Are you all right?" he asked Hazel. "Perfect," she said. The word she had once told him was inadequate for what she felt. "Absolutely perfect." The years settled into the good shape of lives that are built on honest foundations. The Cobre Rojo operation continued to prosper. The consortium dealings were managed, renegotiated as needed, and when they were not satisfactory, Albert walked away from them with the same certainty he had walked away from Morse's original terms, and Hazel renegotiated them back on better grounds. They had learned, in business as in everything, that their respective strengths were more powerful in combination than either was alone. Albert's strategic instinct and capital, and the authority that came with his name in the territory's cattle world, and Hazel's precision and legal intelligence, and the kind of detailed operational knowledge that came from growing up on land and loving it. James grew into a serious, curious boy who wanted to understand everything, who asked questions that were sometimes unanswerable and did not accept evasive answers, a trait he had from both sides of his family, as Albert and Hazel agreed privately with equal amounts of pride and resignation. He was good with the animals and better with numbers, and by the time he was 8, he was reading the operations accounts with the absorbed attention of someone who had found his natural habitat. Clara was entirely different and entirely herself, louder and more physical and more interested in the actual cattle work than James was at the same age, which surprised no one who had watched her as a baby, and understood that she had arrived with a complete and settled personality that the world was simply going to have to accommodate. She did, eventually, name some of the cows, which James protested formally, and which Hazel adjudicated with a ruling that both children found partially satisfying, which she told Albert was the definition of good jurisprudence. In the spring of 1889, New Mexico Territory was moving steadily toward statehood, and the legal landscape of land ownership was becoming more complex and more consequential. Albert spent several weeks in Santa Fe consulting with territorial legislators about ranching interests, and came back to find that Hazel had, in his absence, renegotiated the water rights agreement with the neighboring property to the east in a way that secured a permanent easement that he had been trying to obtain for 4 years. He read the new agreement at the kitchen table and then put it down and looked at her. "You didn't tell me you were working on this," he said. "You were in Santa Fe," she said, "and Mrs. Castro approached me directly. It seemed efficient to handle it. Hazel, this is a better result than anything I had managed." "I know," she said without particular modesty. "I think the difference is that Mrs. Castro wanted to talk to someone who would listen carefully to what she actually needed rather than tell her what the standard terms were, so I listened." He looked at the agreement again. He looked at her. He shook his head slowly in a way that was purely admiration. "I am going to tell you," he said, "for approximately the 100th time that you are remarkable." "And I will tell you for approximately the 100th time," she said, "that I am simply paying attention." He stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen to where she was and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him with the ease of a person who has been held by the same person for many years and finds it exactly right. "I missed you," he said quietly, "while I was in Santa Fe, more than is practical for a business trip." "I know," she said. "I missed you too. The house is entirely different without you in it. Good different or bad different." She turned to look at him over her shoulder. "You know the answer to that." He kissed her, and outside the window the spring light was coming down on the east ridge, and the creek was running high from the snowmelt, and somewhere across the property James was explaining something important to the cows, and Clara was running ahead of Cord along the fence line in boots she had outgrown and refused to acknowledge. The life they had built was not without difficulty, because no life is. There were dry years when the pastures struggled and the accounts were tight, and there were arguments between them that were honest and sometimes sharp, because two people with strong opinions who live and work together in close quarters do not avoid conflict by pretending it isn't there. They navigate it, and Hazel and Albert had learned to navigate it with the same directness they brought to everything, fighting fairly and resolving completely, and never carrying things past a day's end. There was a year when Albert's health gave him trouble, a persistent illness in the winter of 1888 that frightened Hazel more than she allowed to show at the time, and which she told him about afterward when he was recovered, in a midnight conversation by the fire when he had asked her what that winter had been like for her. "Terrifying," she said, with the plainness that only came at midnight. "I understood then what I had built my life around, which is you, and I did not know what to do with that fear." "You showed none of it," he said. "I showed it to the creek," she said. "Every morning for 3 weeks I walked down to the creek and stood there and felt it all, and then I walked back up to the house and was useful." He reached over and took her hand. "Hazel, you recovered," she said. "You are here." "I am here," he confirmed. She looked at the fire. "I am not someone who prays with any frequency," she said, "but those 3 weeks I remembered how." He held her hand and said nothing, because she had given him something true and it needed to be received without words. They were in their early 40s by the time the century was approaching its turn, and the territory they had watched grow was becoming something both larger and more legible: roads and telegraph lines, and the increasing permanence of institutions that had once seemed provisional. The cattle industry had changed around them, shifting with markets and railroad access and the slow enclosure of what had been open range, and Albert had navigated those changes with the pragmatic adaptability that had served him since his 20s. What had not changed was the essential fact of the Shepard property: the house on the East Ridge. The creek with the desert willows planted by a bride who had come to this land many decades ago. The north pasture where the grass came in good every year that the rain cooperated. The deed, held in both names, Hazel first. There came an afternoon in the fall of 1891, one of those perfect autumn afternoons when the high desert offers its clearest and most generous version of itself, when James was nearly 9 and Clara was 5, and the whole property was going gold and copper in the October light, when Albert went looking for Hazel and found her at the creek, standing under the desert willows by her mother's grave. He stopped at a distance and watched her. She was standing very still, not praying or crying or anything dramatic, just standing in the presence of her mother and the trees her mother had planted, which were tall now and graceful, their narrow leaves trembling silver in the small breeze. She became aware of him and turned, and he walked to her. He stood beside her and looked at the tree and at the simple stone that had been set there years before. "I was telling her about Clara," Hazel said. "She would have been very taken with Clara." "I think Clara would have had opinions about everyone," Albert said. "That comes from me," Hazel said, clearly. He put his arm around her. She leaned against him. "James asked me this morning," she said, "what the inscription on the stone says." "What did you tell him?" "I told him it says Margaret Shepard, beloved, and he said, 'Beloved by who?' And I said, 'By everyone who knew her and by this land.' And he thought about that for a while and then said, 'I think I understand that. I think I love this land too.'" Albert looked at the creek moving in the afternoon light. "He does," he said. "He's a shepherd." "He is a Walden," Hazel said, with a slight emphasis. "He is both," Albert said. She tilted her head against his shoulder. The water moved over the stones in the creek bed, and the willow leaves trembled, and the sun was warm on the red earth. "Albert," she said, "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that this is the life I would have chosen. If I could have seen it all, the beginning and everything that came after, I would have chosen all of it." He held her a little tighter. His throat was doing something he was not going to address directly. "Even the first day," he said, standing in front of the land office. "Even the first day," she said, "because it brought you walking past." He turned his head and pressed his lips to her hair, which was still more auburn than gray, though the gray was coming, the honest silver threads of a woman who had lived fully in a hard and beautiful place. "I would choose it too," he said, "every day of it." They stood there for a while longer, by the creek and the willows and the grave of the woman who had planted the trees, while up at the house their children were doing what children do on autumn afternoons, being alive and loud and entirely themselves, and the sun moved slowly west over the desert. That evening, at the table with James and Clara and the windows open to the cooling air, there was dinner and argument about whose job it was to feed the chickens, and a story James wanted to tell about something Biscuit had done at the fence. And Clara insisted on telling her own version of the same story, which differed from James's in every significant detail and was probably more accurate. Albert sat at his end of the table and watched his family, this specific, irreplaceable collection of people who were his in the truest sense, the sense of shared work and shared years and chosen love, and he felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has built something real. Hazel at the other end of the table caught his eye across the noise in the lamplight. She was smiling, just slightly. The smile she kept for him. He smiled back. Outside, the stars came up over the desert in their thousands, the same stars that had been there the night he had held her hand at the Founders' Day dance and everything had shifted, the same stars over the ridge and the creek and the pasture where the cattle moved slowly in the dark. The deed in the strongbox by the fireplace had both their names on it, hers first, and the land that had held 3 generations of Shepards was holding something new now. Not just a family name, but a family, built from a fair deal and a cup of coffee at Milligan's, and a man who had stopped on a boardwalk. Because of the way, a woman held herself together when the world had just done its worst. Clara was saying something with great urgency to James, who was pretending not to listen with the transparent false indifference of an older sibling. James was pretending badly because he was actually listening, because Clara was frequently right and he had learned this early. Hazel reached across the table and settled Clara's gesturing hand gently. "Eat," she said. But James said, "James will still have said it after dinner," Hazel said. Clara considered the logic of this, picked up her fork. Albert caught Hazel's eye again. The amusement passed between them without words. They cleared the table together after the children had been sent to bed. The familiar choreography of 2 people who know exactly how the other moves in a kitchen, who have washed dishes together in this house in winter and summer and every season between, talking sometimes and sometimes in comfortable silence. And tonight it was silence, warm and full. He handed her a dried dish and she put it in the cabinet, and he thought, for no particular reason except that it was true, that this was it. This was the thing that all the work and all the years had been toward. Not the consortium deal or the acreage or the Shepard name restored or any individual triumph. This, the ordinary evening in the kitchen, the woman beside him, the children asleep in their rooms, the land outside holding them. He said her name. She looked at him. "Nothing," he said. "I just wanted to say it." She looked at him for a moment with those green eyes that had seen everything he was and found it sufficient, and more than sufficient. She reached up and touched his face briefly, the way she sometimes did, just the warmth of her hand against his cheek, and then she went back to the dishes. Outside, the desert night settled into its full depth, cool and vast and full of stars, over the house on the east ridge, over the creek and the willows, over the north pasture where the cattle were quiet and the fence line was solid, over the land that bore both their names, hers first, the way it was always going to be. The life they had built held them both, exactly as it was made to do, and it was good.